The low hum of conversations filled the elegant restaurant, silverware clinking against plates as laughter and murmured discussions echoed through the dimly lit space. The company dinner had gone as expected: polite small talk, forced smiles, and a familiar ache of loneliness gnawing at her. Her husband sat across the table, engaged in a deep discussion about market trends with his colleagues, barely glancing her way. It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. But tonight, the feeling of being invisible stung more than usual. A warm presence settled beside her, his voice smooth and confident. "Enjoying the evening?" Richard's tone was casual, but the way his eyes lingered on hers made her stomach tighten. Her husband's boss had always carried himself with authority, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was older, refined, exuding power in a way that made people naturally gravitate toward him. She turned slightly, offering a polite smile. "It's nice," she replied, though the lack of enthusiasm in her voice was evident. Richard chuckled, swirling the drink in his glass before taking a slow sip. "Your husband's quite the dedicated worker. Hardly takes his eyes off his laptop, does he?" His words held amusement, but underneath there was something else. Something calculated. She hesitated before responding, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her wine glass. "He works hard, always has." Richard nodded, leaning in just enough that his next words were meant only for her. "Some men get so caught up in building an empire that they forget what truly matters." His eyes didn't leave hers, and for the first time that night she felt seen. The air between them changed. The weight of his presence settled over her, different from the passing flirtations she'd brushed off in the past. This wasn't harmless, this wasn't playful. It was an invitation, unspoken but clear. She should have ended the conversation, excused herself, or made it clear where she stood. Instead, she remained still, the words caught in her throat as her heart pounded just a little too hard. The rational part of her whispered warnings, reminding her of the ring on her finger, of the man sitting just feet away. But there was another part, a darker, restless part, that was tempted by the attention, the allure of something forbidden. Richard watched her closely, reading her hesitation, sensing the battle waging inside her. His voice lowered, his next words more deliberate. "I want you." Her breath hitched, the directness of his statement slicing through her like a sharp blade. No pretense, no unnecessary buildup, just a simple truth, offered like a challenge. Her pulse raced, her lips parting slightly as if to respond, but no words came. She should have said no, should have shut it down immediately. Instead, she just sat there, absorbing the weight of what had just been spoken, knowing that by not saying anything at all, she had already answered him. The drive home was quiet, but her mind was anything but. Richard's words echoed in her head, his voice smooth, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. "I want you." He had said it so confidently, without hesitation, without fear of rejection. And the worst part? She hadn't said no. She hadn't even tried. Lying in bed that night, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of her husband's laptop across the room. He hadn't even noticed the change in her demeanor when they got home. He had barely acknowledged her at the dinner, only looking up from his work to mumble a good night before returning to his emails. The distance between them stretched beyond the physical. This was an emotional chasm that had been growing for months, maybe even years. She thought back to the early days, when they couldn't keep their hands off each other, when his focus was on her, not his career. Now everything revolved around work. Dinners were silent, affection was routine at best, and passion had become a distant memory. The ache of loneliness had settled so deeply inside her that she had almost stopped noticing it, until tonight. Until Richard. The following afternoon, she found herself at her husband's office, dropping off a folder he had forgotten at home. She had debated leaving it with the receptionist, but something pulled her forward, making her step onto the sleek, polished floor of his building. The office was cold, professional, filled with people who barely spared her a glance as she walked through the corridor toward his office. And then she saw him. Richard was standing near the conference room, speaking with another executive. He was mid-conversation when his gaze landed on her. The shift in his expression was instant, a flicker of amusement, interest, and something darker. He excused himself smoothly, making his way toward her with the same confidence that had shaken her the night before. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She held up the folder, in response. "My husband forgot this." Richard smirked, as if the mention of her husband was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. "And yet I have a feeling that's not the only reason you came." Heat crept up her neck at his boldness. "You think too much of yourself." His smile didn't waver. "Or maybe I just recognize when someone is searching for something they've been missing." Her pulse quickened. She should have walked away. She should have ignored the pull between them. But instead she stood there waiting for what he would say next. "Come have coffee with me," Richard said smoothly. "Just a conversation. Nothing more." Her breath caught in her throat. Every rational part of her screamed to refuse. And yet, the loneliness, the neglect, the way her heart raced at his attention, all of it made her whisper the word she knew she would regret. "Okay." The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where business meetings took place in hushed voices and stolen glances went unnoticed. She sat across from Richard, fingers wrapped around the warmth of her coffee cup, though her hands felt anything but steady. He had chosen the place, private enough to avoid unwanted attention, yet not so secluded that it felt improper. Still, the air between them carried the weight of something unspoken, something charged. Richard watched her carefully, his gaze steady, unhurried. "You seem nervous," he noted, taking a slow sip of his espresso. She forced a small laugh, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I just don't usually do this." "This?" His lips curled into a smirk, one that made her stomach tighten. "Having coffee? Or sitting across from a man who isn't your husband?" She exhaled sharply, his bluntness catching her off guard. "You're very direct." "I don't play games," Richard said, leaning in slightly. "I say what I want. I want you." Her breath hitched at the certainty in his voice. He didn't waver, didn't soften his words to make them less dangerous. He laid them in front of her like an open invitation, waiting for her to decide what came next. She swallowed hard, searching for a response that wouldn't betray how fast her pulse had become. "Richard—" "You can say no," he interrupted, tilting his head slightly. "You can tell me you don't feel this, that you haven't thought about me the way I've thought about you. You can walk out that door and I won't stop you." She gripped her cup tighter. That was the problem. She didn't want to say no. She didn't want to pretend there wasn't something happening here, something intoxicating. "I don't know what you expect me to say," she admitted, her voice quieter now, as if the truth were something fragile. Richard leaned back, watching her with knowing eyes. "I expect you to be honest. With me, with yourself." Honesty. It sounded so simple, yet it was the most dangerous thing she could offer him in this moment. She let out a slow breath, testing the words before she spoke them. "I like the way you look at me." The confession sent a thrill through her, and when Richard's smirk deepened, she knew she had already given him more than she should have. "I look at you like a man who sees what he wants," he said smoothly. "And I think you like being wanted." She should have denied it. She should have shut it down right then and there. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly closer, drawn to the heat between them. Richard didn't move, didn't rush. He was patient, letting her come to him, letting her be the one to decide how far she was willing to go. And in that moment, she knew. She wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. The evening stretched out before her, quiet and still, the absence of her husband noticeable in every empty space of their home. His business trip had been planned for weeks, but now, in the silence, it felt like an open door, an invitation to something she wasn't sure she could resist. Her phone vibrated on the counter, the soft buzz cutting through the stillness. She didn't have to check to know who it was. Richard. Long night ahead? I could keep you company. The words sent a shiver through her, a thrill mingling with the weight of guilt pressing on her chest. She shouldn't respond. She should delete the message, turn off her phone, and forget the way his voice had made her feel over coffee. But her fingers moved before she could stop them. Come over. The second she hit send, her breath caught in her throat. There was no taking it back now. Minutes felt like hours as she waited. The anticipation coiled tightly inside her, a dangerous mix of excitement and apprehension. When the knock finally came, her heart pounded so hard she thought it might betray her. She opened the door to find Richard standing there, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. He stepped inside without a word, closing the door behind him. The space between them was charged, the tension thick enough to suffocate. I wasn't sure you'd actually say yes, Richard murmured, his voice, smoother than she remembered, edged with something deeper, something knowing. She swallowed hard, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Neither was I. His eyes darkened, a flicker of amusement playing at the corner of his mouth. Then tell me to leave. She didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she stood there, letting the silence speak louder than any words could. Richard took a step forward, slow and deliberate, as if giving her every chance to change her mind. She didn't move. His hand lifted, fingers grazing her arm lightly, sending a trail of fire in their wake. The touch was barely there, but it was enough. Enough to make her breath hitch. Enough to shatter the thin line between hesitation and surrender. Richard's hand slid up, fingers brushing the side of her neck, his thumb tracing the rapid beat of her pulse. You know how this ends, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. She did. And yet, she tilted her head slightly, her lips parting just enough to welcome the moment she had known was inevitable. Richard didn't hesitate. His mouth claimed hers in a kiss that was anything but hesitant. It was demanding, consuming, filled with all the pent-up tension between them. Her body responded before her mind could protest, hands gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. The last thread of restraint snapped, and suddenly, the weight of morality was nothing compared to the intoxicating pull of desire. The warmth of his breath fanned over her skin, as his lips traveled lower, his hands exploring places that hadn't been touched in far too long. Every nerve in her body was alight with sensation, every inch of her consumed by the heat between them. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, only the rush of adrenaline, the intoxicating mix of pleasure and danger colliding in the dimly lit room. Her fingers tangled in his hair as he pulled her closer, his body pressing against hers in a way that left no space for doubt. This wasn't just attraction. It was hunger, years of neglect unraveling in the span of a few stolen moments. Every sigh, every touch, every desperate kiss only drove them further into something neither could turn back from. Somewhere in the back of her mind, reality clawed at her, whispering warnings, flashing images of the life she had built, the man she had promised forever to. But Richard's touch drowned it out, his hands tracing the curve of her spine, his lips setting fire to every part of her that had long been ignored. Time blurred, lost in the frenzy of limbs and breathless whispers. She wasn't just giving in to him, she was surrendering to herself, to the longing she had buried beneath responsibilities, to the part of her that craved to feel wanted, needed. And then it was over. The room was silent except for their heavy breathing, the air thick with the scent of sweat and satisfaction. Her body still tingled from his touch, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down harder than his hands ever had. Lying on her side, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing even as her body remained still. Richard was beside her, his fingers lazily tracing circles on her bare shoulder. The warmth of his skin should have been comforting, but it only heightened the storm raging inside her. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand, shattering the quiet. Panic shot through her veins as she reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. The name on the screen made her chest tighten. Husband. Richard watched her, his expression unreadable, his fingers still resting lightly on her skin as if daring her to answer. She hesitated before picking up, pressing the phone to her ear, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Hey," she whispered, her throat dry. Her husband's voice came through, warm, unsuspecting. "Hey, babe, just wanted to check in before bed. How's your night?" Her stomach twisted painfully. She could still feel Richard beside her, his presence impossible to ignore. "Good," she lied, her voice softer than usual. "Just relaxing." Richard smirked slightly, rolling onto his back, arms behind his head as he listened to her navigate the conversation. When she hung up, the silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. This wasn't over, and they both knew it. The morning light seeped through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room, but inside her there was nothing but cold, sinking dread. She sat up slowly, the sheets tangled around her body, the weight of last night pressing down harder than she expected. Richard was gone. At some point before dawn, he had left without a word, leaving only the scent of his cologne lingering in the air. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, pressing her palms against her face, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume her. Guilt clawed at her chest, but beneath it, buried deep, was something even more dangerous. Thrill. A sick, intoxicating thrill that sent a shiver through her spine when she thought about the way Richard had touched her, the way he had looked at her like she was something to be devoured. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Her heart lurched, fearing it would be her husband, but when she glanced at the screen, a different name stared back at her. Richard. "Last night was exactly how I imagined it would be, and it won't be the last." Her breath hitched, fingers tightening around the device. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't apologize. He didn't wonder if she regretted it. He was confident, certain that whatever had started between them wasn't ending here. And the worst part? He wasn't wrong. She should have ignored the message. She should have blocked his number and forced herself to forget. Instead, she found herself reading it again, feeling the heat return to her cheeks, a pulse of something dark and thrilling settling in her stomach. Downstairs, the front door clicked open. Her husband. Panic shot through her, but she masked it quickly, forcing herself into motion. She grabbed her robe, wrapping it around her body as she rushed to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, flushed skin, lips still swollen, eyes heavy with exhaustion. She scrubbed a hand over her face, forcing normalcy onto herself, willing her expression to remain composed. By the time she stepped into the hallway, he was already in the kitchen, setting his bag down on the counter. "Hey," he greeted, his voice casual, unsuspecting. "Got in early. Figured I'd surprise you." Her stomach clenched. Surprise. If only he knew. She forced a smile, stepping closer to place a light kiss on his cheek. "That's a nice surprise," she said smoothly, the lies slipping out easier than she thought they would. But inside, she was unraveling. As he moved around the kitchen, talking about his trip, she barely heard a word. Her mind was elsewhere, on the text, on the man who had sent it, on the undeniable pull she had toward him despite everything it threatened to destroy. Her phone buzzed again. This time, she didn't have to check. She already knew it was him, and she already knew she was going to answer. Days passed, but the fire that had been ignited refused to burn out. Each stolen moment with Richard only fueled the desire, the need to feel something more than routine. Their encounters became more frequent, hotel rooms, his office, even stolen moments in her car when neither of them could wait. She was spiraling, unable to stop, unwilling to stop. Her husband began to notice the changes. She was more distant, distracted, always checking her phone with a nervous edge she couldn't fully hide. The way she used to reach for him at night had faded, replaced with hurried excuses, with a heart that wasn't in the same room anymore. "You've been different lately," he mentioned one evening, his eyes searching hers for an answer she wasn't ready to give. "Is everything okay?" She forced a smile, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Just tired. Work has been overwhelming." He nodded, accepting her words, but the suspicion lingered in his gaze. Richard, however, showed no hesitation. He sent messages without care, called her without concern. He thrived on the secrecy, the danger of it all. But something in her started to shift. The thrill was beginning to feel like a trap, the weight of her choices pressing down harder with each passing day. The lies piled higher, suffocating her. She was in too deep. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and it would all crumble. She had to decide. Walk away before it was too late, or keep playing with fire, knowing it would eventually consume everything.